The sun had barely cleared the pines surrounding Raven Ridge Marine installation when a lone woman in plain civilian clothes began walking the long gravel shoulder toward the main gate. She carried nothing but a small canvas bag slung across one shoulder and a sealed courier pouch tucked beneath her arm. The kind of pouch that never left government hands without a signature. Nobody watching from the roadside would have guessed that the woman moving with such quiet, measured steps commanded every soul behind that fence line. Colonel Sienna Crow preferred it that way. She had vanished from public record entirely, swallowed into a classified assignment that even her closest staff could not name aloud. And now she was coming home the same way she always did after such missions, unannounced, unescorted, and dressed like anyone else on the road. The rules governing her return were strict and had been strict for years. No military vehicle was permitted to meet a returning commander from a sealed operation. No radio chatter could reference her name until she cleared the perimeter herself, and no advanced warning could reach the gate staff beyond a general note that senior personnel might arrive on foot. It was a security measure Sienna had helped design herself, born from a career spent watching complacency creep into installations that assumed danger always announced itself with rank insignia and polished boots. She trusted the system precisely because it did not trust appearances, and she had walked through that same gate a dozen times before without incident, nodding to young sentries who checked her identification and waved her through like anyone else. Years earlier, Sienna had enlisted straight out of college against the wishes of a family who had imagined a quieter, safer life for her, one built around a desk and a steady paycheck rather than deployments and danger. She had risen through the ranks slowly, deliberately, earning every promotion through performance rather than favor, aware always that she carried a weight her peers did not, that every mistake she made would be remembered longer and judged harder than the mistakes of others around her. That awareness had never made her bitter. It had made her precise. She built habits of discipline so consistent that even her harshest early critics eventually ran out of grounds for doubt. And by the time she took command of Raven Ridge, few among the senior ranks questioned whether she had earned the eagle on her collar or the stars that would likely follow it one day. Officer Drake, Callan, was not one of those sentries. He was city police assigned to a joint traffic detail near the installation entrance, while a section of roadway underwent repair, and he had spent the better part of the morning directing cars around orange cones with the restless energy of a man who found stillness intolerable. Callan had a reputation among his precinct for trusting his gut over his paperwork, a habit that had earned him both commendations and complaints in roughly equal measure. He liked to say that instinct never lied to him, and he said it often enough that his colleagues had learned not to argue. When he saw a woman on foot approaching a heavily secured military gate with no vehicle, no visible escort, and no uniform, that instinct began humming immediately. The base's own identification cameras, the ones that would normally have flagged her biometric signature the moment she stepped within range, were down for scheduled maintenance. A coincidence of timing that would later strike everyone involved as almost cruelly precise. The young Marine posted at the pedestrian checkpoint recognized nothing unusual in a woman approaching with a sealed pouch. Classified couriers arrived that way often enough, but Colin was standing just outside the perimeter fence on the civilian side of the road, technically outside the base's jurisdiction and well within his own. And something about the calm, unhurried way she carried herself struck him as rehearsed rather than natural. He stepped into her path before she reached the checkpoint gate. He asked for identification in the clipped testing tone he used on anyone he had already decided was hiding something. Sienna stopped, unbothered, and explained without a flicker of irritation that her credentials were sealed within the courier pouch under her arm, a pouch that could not be opened outside a secure facility without violating the very protocol that protected the mission she had just completed. She offered to have the checkpoint sentry verify her through proper channels, gesturing calmly toward the young Marine only a few dozen feet away. It was a simple, reasonable answer, the kind any trained officer would have accepted while awaiting confirmation. Callan did not accept it. He decided, standing there in the gathering light with cars slowing to watch, that he had found something worth proving. He told her flatly that walking distances the way she was to a military installation this size, without a vehicle, without visible credentials, and with a sealed bag she refused to open, matched a pattern he had seen before among people impersonating military officers to gain access to restricted property. Sienna's expression did not change. She had faced far worse than a skeptical patrolman in her career, and she understood better than he did in that moment exactly how serious the accusation he was building toward would become. Still, she gave him one last chance to simply do his job correctly and let the process unfold as it was designed to. Her voice remained level, almost gentle, when she told him that he still had time to stop what he was about to start. Callan did not take it as a warning. He took it as confirmation. In his mind, only someone caught in a lie would speak with that kind of practiced calm instead of panic. And he had built his entire career on reading exactly that kind of behavior. He straightened his shoulders, rested one hand near his belt, and told her she was being detained on suspicion of impersonating a military officer. His voice pitched loud enough that the sentry at the pedestrian gate turned his head toward the commotion. It was the declaration that would end his career, though nobody standing on that stretch of road yet understood it. For Callan, in that instant, it felt like vindication. A small crowd had already begun to gather along the shoulder. Drivers who had pulled over out of curiosity, a delivery driver who had parked to watch rather than continue his route. Callan motioned for Sienna to place her hands on the hood of his patrol vehicle, his tone hardening into the clipped cadence officers used when they believed a situation might escalate. She complied without resistance, setting the courier pouch carefully on the hood beside her rather than letting it drop. A small act of discipline that seemed to annoy him more than reassure him. A few onlookers murmured that the whole thing looked wrong, that something about detaining a calm, composed woman outside a military gate did not sit right, but nobody stepped forward. Callan's raised voice made clear he would treat interference the same as resistance. A woman, near the front of the gathered onlookers, pulled out her phone and began recording, murmuring to the man beside her that something about the whole scene felt deeply wrong, that a person who spoke so calmly and offered so reasonable an explanation did not belong in handcuffs on the side of a public road. The delivery driver who had parked to watch found himself gripping his steering wheel, torn between the instinct to intervene and the practical knowledge that inserting himself into a police matter rarely improved anything. Farther back, an elderly man walking his dog paused at the edge of the crowd, shaking his head slowly at what he was witnessing, muttering under his breath that he had seen this particular kind of certainty before, and it rarely ended well for the officer wielding it. Among the small crowd stood two off-duty service members who had been walking toward the pedestrian gate themselves, drawn back from breakfast at a diner just outside the perimeter. Both recognized something in the woman's bearing. The stillness of her stance, the practiced way she kept her hands visible, and her voice even, that did not match the panic of someone caught in a lie. One of them took a half-step forward as if to intervene, but Callan's warning carried clearly across the gravel, promising that anyone who interfered would be arrested alongside her. The young man hesitated, torn between instinct and consequence. And in that hesitation, Callan reached for his handcuffs. Sienna offered no resistance as the cold metal closed around her wrists behind her back. She had been through worse indignities during a career that had tested her patience and her restraint more times than she cared to count, and she understood with total clarity that resisting now would only strengthen whatever narrative Callan had already constructed in his mind. Instead, she simply repeated, quietly enough that only Callan and the nearest onlookers could hear, that he still had a window to stop this before it went further than either of them could undo. He laughed, a short, satisfied sound, certain he had caught something significant, and began walking her toward the rear door of his patrol vehicle. It was the young sentry at the pedestrian checkpoint who acted first, radioing into the base command center with the kind of unease in his voice that made the watch officer on duty sit up straighter. He reported that a civilian, claiming to be a colonel, had just been detained and handcuffed by city police directly outside the installation's main approach, and that something about the description matched a name he had only ever seen on classified travel manifests. The watch officer, a young lieutenant who knew enough of the post that he still double-checked everything twice, pulled up the restricted personnel schedule out of pure procedural habit rather than any real suspicion. What he saw on the screen made the blood drain slowly from his face, and he reached for the secure line to the executive officer's desk without waiting to be certain. Inside the command building, Captain Ria Voss had just settled behind her desk with a cup of coffee still too hot to drink when her line rang with the kind of urgency reserved for genuine emergencies. She listened to the lieutenant's report with a stillness that masked the alarm building underneath, asking him twice to repeat the description of the woman being detained at the gate. Voss had served as executive officer under Colonel Crow for years, long enough to know the exact protocol surrounding her commander's classified travel, long enough to know that this was in fact the scheduled return for a mission that had kept the entire senior staff on edge. She pulled the sealed itinerary from her secure drawer with hands that were not quite steady. The itinerary confirmed what she feared. Colonel Crow was due to arrive on foot, alone, unescorted, exactly as described. Voss immediately ordered the base's satellite-linked identification system brought online ahead of its scheduled maintenance completion, overriding the technician's protests with the flat authority of someone who understood exactly how much was at stake. Within moments, a grainy but unmistakable feed appeared on the command center's central monitor, showing a woman in civilian clothes standing with her hands cuffed behind her back beside a city patrol vehicle at the edge of the installation's perimeter. Voss stared at the screen without breathing for several long seconds. There was no mistaking the posture, the set of the shoulders, the calm stillness in the face, even under handcuffs. It was Colonel Sienna Crow, commander of Raven Ridge, first black woman ever to hold that post, standing restrained outside her own base by a city officer who clearly had no idea whose wrists he had just bound. Voss set down her untouched coffee, rose from her chair, and issued the order that would set the entire installation into motion within seconds. She activated the base's internal alert system, invoking a protocol that existed on paper but had never once in the history of Raven Ridge actually been triggered. The designation that flashed across every screen and speaker on base read simply as the Commander's Security Protocol, a phrase that carried weight far beyond its plain wording. It meant that the base's highest-ranking officer was believed to be in immediate physical restraint or danger outside the wire, and it authorized an immediate full-scale response without waiting for further clarification. Alarms began sounding through the corridors of the command building and within the security office. Major Callum Thorne looked up from his morning briefing with the particular stillness of a man who had trained for exactly this scenario and never once expected to use it. I was already moving before the alarm finished its first cycle. Out at the gate, Colin remained entirely unaware that anything unusual was unfolding just beyond the fence line he considered irrelevant to his authority. He was reading Sienna her rights in the flat procedural tone of a man confident he had done everything correctly, gesturing for her to duck into the back of his patrol car so he could transport her to the precinct for booking. The small crowd along the roadside had grown larger, murmuring uneasily. Several people now recording the scene on their phones, despite Callan's occasional glare in their direction. Sienna said nothing further, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed calmly on some point past the fence line where she knew with total certainty help was already coming. The sound reached the gate before the vehicles did. A low mechanical groan followed by a piercing siren that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Callan froze with one hand still on the patrol car door, watching in confusion as the two massive steel gate panels that had stood open all morning began sliding shut with a grinding, unstoppable momentum. Anti-vehicle barriers he had never noticed before rose from the roadway itself, thick steel columns locking into place with a finality that made the asphalt tremble slightly beneath his boots. Red emergency lighting began pulsing along the fence line in both directions, and somewhere behind the gate he could hear the distant thunder of engines starting all at once. His radio, which had carried routine traffic all morning, suddenly went dead in his hand, the base's communications override severing his link to dispatch the instant the protocol activated. Colin stared at the closed gate, at the flashing lights, at the sheer scale of steel and concrete now sealing off the entire installation from the outside world, and felt something cold settle in his stomach that his instincts had never warned him about. He turned back toward Sienna, still standing calmly beside his vehicle, with her hands cuffed behind her, and for the first time that morning found himself without a single confident thing to say. A convoy of armored vehicles came tearing around the bend inside the perimeter, kicking up dust as they closed the distance toward the gate at a speed that made bystanders on the civilian side step back instinctively. The vehicles braked hard just inside the fence line, and doors flew open in near unison as more than 100 Marines poured out onto the roadway, forming ranks with a speed and precision that spoke of drills run 1,000 times before. At the head of the formation walked Major Callum Thorne, his face set in the particular grim focus of an officer who had just watched on a live feed. Someone treat his commanding officer like a common trespasser. Thorne had served under Sienna for years, long enough to trust her judgment without question, and long enough to recognize instantly, from the moment the alert crossed his desk, exactly how serious the situation outside the gate had to be for the protocol to trigger at all. He had run the drill 100 times in training simulations, always assuming that if it ever activated for real, the threat would come from outside the fence rather than from a single, overconfident officer standing on public roadway. The absurdity of the actual circumstances did nothing to soften his urgency. If anything, it sharpened it, because a threat born from carelessness and assumption was, in his experience, often harder to correct than one born from malice. Thorne's eyes found Sienna immediately through the narrowing gap in the closing gate, and what he saw, her wrists bound, her posture still perfectly composed despite the indignity, struck him with a force that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with fury carefully restrained. He said nothing at first, simply raising one hand in a sharp, silent signal that every Marine behind him understood instantly. The gate finished its slow, grinding closure, sealing the base completely, and in the sudden quiet that followed, Thorne's voice cut across the roadway with the force of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to make silence answer to him. He called the formation to attention, and the response came like a single unified heartbeat, boots striking gravel in perfect unison as more than 100 Marines snapped upright, chests forward, eyes fixed dead ahead. It was not aimed at the gate, not at Callan, not at the small crowd of stunned onlookers along the civilian's shoulder. It was aimed directly at the woman standing handcuffed beside a patrol car. A wordless, thunderous acknowledgement of exactly who she was and exactly how far this had gone wrong. Colin felt the weight of that unified motion settle over him like a physical thing, and for the first time since he had stepped into her path that morning, doubt began to crack through his certainty. Captain Voss arrived moments later on foot, having sprinted the distance from the command building the instant the convoy departed. Her uniform slightly disheveled from the effort, but her expression carrying an authority that needed no adjustment. She moved past the ranks of standing Marines without hesitation, coming to a stop directly in front of Sienna, and the apology that left her lips carried none of the formal detachment Callan might have expected. She addressed her simply and directly as Colonel, her voice tight with something between relief and barely restrained anger, and reached for the key that would free her commander's wrists without waiting for permission from anyone standing nearby. The cuffs came free with a small metallic click that seemed to echo far louder than it should have across the sudden silence of the roadway. Colin watched the exchange with a growing sick certainty settling into his chest, the instinct he had trusted so completely now offering nothing but a hollow, useless silence. He opened his mouth to say something, some half-formed protest that he had simply been doing his job, that anyone in his position would have made the same call, but the words dried up somewhere before they reached his throat. Voss turned toward him, and for a moment her gaze held something almost like pity beneath the anger. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she pulled up a secure tablet from the courier bag Sienna had carried the entire time, entering a clearance code that unlocked a service record. Most people at Raven Ridge had only ever heard referenced in passing conversation. The screen filled with commendations that read like a condensed history of decades of service under fire. Honors earned not behind a desk, but in places where the difference between calm judgment and panic decided who came home. A Bronze Star for actions during an overseas deployment. Few outside classified circles knew the details of. A Legion of Merit awarded for sustained excellence in command that had shaped strategy across multiple theaters. A Purple Heart earned from wounds sustained protecting personnel under her charge during an ambush that official records still described only in the barest outline. Beneath those honors sat her current posting, listed in plain, unambiguous text that Callan read 3 times before the meaning fully settled. Commanding Officer, Raven Ridge, Marine Installation. The very base whose gate he had been standing beside all morning. The very installation whose perimeter he had just watched seal itself shut in response to his own actions. He had handcuffed the woman who commanded every soldier now standing in formation before him. The woman with legal authority over the very ground he had detained her on, based on nothing more than an instinct that had this single time been catastrophically wrong. Word of the incident had already begun traveling beyond the base itself, carried through the same radio silence that had cut Callan off from his own dispatch, routed instead through official channels that connected directly to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Gideon Hale received the call while still finishing his morning coffee at his desk, and the details relayed to him. A city officer handcuffing a Marine colonel outside a federal installation, an entire base locking down in response, were serious enough that he left immediately without waiting for a second briefing. He arrived at Raven Ridge, driving through a temporary access point. Thorne's security team had opened specifically for his vehicle, his expression grim the entire way in. Hale had known Callan for years, had in fact championed his promotion through the ranks more than once on the strength of instincts that had, until now, mostly proven correct. He pulled the dashboard and body camera footage from Callan's patrol vehicle the moment he arrived, reviewing it in the back of a security office while Thorne and Voss stood nearby, neither offering analysis, both letting the footage speak entirely for itself. What the recording showed was damning in its simplicity. A calm, cooperative woman offering a clear, reasonable explanation, and an officer who had dismissed that explanation before she finished speaking, choosing instead to escalate toward restraint without ever attempting the basic verification his training required. Hale noted with a tightening jaw that Callan had never once radioed for backup verification from base security, never once asked the pedestrian checkpoint sentry standing barely 30 feet away to confirm her identity, never once waited, even the few minutes it would have taken for a proper identification check to clear her entirely. Every failure was procedural, documented, and entirely avoidable. He set the tablet down and exhaled slowly, already understanding that this was not a case he could soften or explain away. Not with a Marine colonel standing in the next room and an entire base having gone to lockdown because of his officers' actions. He thought back unwillingly to the handful of complaints filed against Callan over the years. Complaints he had always found reasons to set aside, citing the young officer's strong arrest record and the confidence with which he carried himself on patrol. Reviewing them now, in light of what the footage showed, those old complaints no longer looked like isolated grievances from difficult members of the public. They looked like a pattern he had chosen not to see, and that failure of oversight sat on his own shoulders every bit as heavily as it sat on Callan's. Hale called in 2 of his senior lieutenants to review the footage independently, wanting confirmation that his own judgment, clouded as it might be by years of professional loyalty, was not somehow softening what the recording plainly showed. Both officers reached the same conclusion within minutes of watching, their faces tightening at the same points in the footage that had troubled Hale. The moment Callan dismissed her explanation outright, the moment he reached for the cuffs without ever glancing toward the sentry standing close enough to confirm her identity in under a minute. There was no ambiguity left to debate. There was only the uncomfortable work of deciding exactly how far the consequences needed to reach. General Elias Croft arrived not long after, summoned personally once word of the incident reached the Corps command structure, his presence at Raven Ridge transforming what had already been a tense morning into something approaching a formal reckoning. Croft had commanded troops for the better part of 4 decades, and carried an authority that needed no raised voice to command a room, his very entrance settling the atmosphere into something colder and more focused. He found Callan waiting in the same security office where Hale had reviewed the footage, the young officer's earlier confidence now entirely drained from his posture. Croft did not sit. He simply asked, in a voice devoid of theatrics, what evidence Callan had possessed before deciding to detain a woman outside a federal installation. Callan's answer, when it finally came, sounded thin even to his own ears. He mentioned instinct, the way she had approached on foot without a vehicle, the way her calm demeanor had struck him as rehearsed rather than genuine, the absence of visible identification, despite her explanation about the sealed pouch. Croft listened to each point without interrupting, then dismantled them one by one with the patient precision of a man who had spent his career distinguishing real threats from manufactured suspicion. Walking to a military installation was not a crime. Calm demeanor under scrutiny was not evidence of deception, and in fact was often the opposite. A sealed classified pouch that could not be opened outside secure facilities was, if anything, evidence supporting her account rather than contradicting it. Throughout the exchange, Sienna sat quietly to one side, her posture composed, her expression giving away nothing of what she might have felt, watching a man who had handcuffed her hours earlier now struggling to justify himself before his own superiors. She had not once, since the cuffs came off, raised her voice or demanded consequence. When Croft finally turned to her and asked whether she wished to add anything, she considered the question for a long moment before answering with the same quiet steadiness she had carried through the entire ordeal. She said simply that authority which came without accountability was not authority at all, only the appearance of it. And that appearance had cost Callan everything the moment it collided with reality. Hale, standing near the door, lowered his head at those words, the weight of professional embarrassment settling visibly across his shoulders. He had trusted Callan's instincts for years, without adequately questioning the pattern behind which instincts got trusted and which people bore the cost when those instincts proved wrong. He said nothing in that moment, but the decision forming behind his eyes was already clear to everyone watching. When Croft finally addressed Callan directly, ordering him to surrender his badge pending a full review, Hale did not object. He simply nodded, already reaching to confirm the order himself. It was General Croft who chose to reveal before the small gathered group in that security office the deeper purpose behind Colonel Crow's habit of returning from classified missions dressed as an ordinary civilian and walking to the gate alone. It was not simple preference or personal humility, though both played some part in it. It was, he explained, a deliberate and long-standing exercise, one Sienna had insisted on personally since taking command of Raven Ridge, designed to test whether the base's security personnel treated every unidentified person with the same procedural rigor, regardless of how they looked or how they carried themselves. In every previous instance, gate personnel and even passing city officers who encountered her on these unannounced returns had followed proper procedure exactly as trained, requesting verification through appropriate channels, waiting patiently for confirmation, treating an unidentified woman with professional courtesy rather than assumption. Callan was the first person in the entire history of that quiet, unofficial test to skip every one of those steps and move directly to physical restraint based on nothing more than a hunch. He had refused to question, even once she offered him a reasonable explanation. The room absorbed that fact in silence, the full weight of what it meant slowly settling over everyone present. Voss, who had known in general terms that her commander occasionally returned this way, but had never understood the deliberate structure behind it, found herself studying Sienna with something close to renewed awe. It was not merely restraint that had kept her commander calm through handcuffs and public humiliation that morning. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had built the very system now working precisely as designed to catch exactly this kind of failure. Croft, watching the realization spread across the room, finally turned to Sienna and asked whether she wished to address the gathered officers and staff who had by now assembled just outside, drawn by news of the lockdown and its resolution. She rose without hesitation, smoothing the plain civilian jacket she still wore, and walked out into the gathering morning light, where a crowd had formed near the reopened section of the perimeter. Marines and city officers and a handful of civilians who had witnessed the original incident, all standing together in uneasy quiet. Sienna did not raise her voice as she began speaking. Yet somehow, every word carried clearly across the assembled crowd, the natural authority of someone who had spent decades commanding attention without needing volume to do it. She spoke first about the uniform Callan wore, and the uniform she herself commanded hundreds of others to wear, noting that neither garment created the character of the person inside it. A badge, she said, was not a substitute for judgment, and rank was not a replacement for restraint. The measure of a person's true character revealed itself most clearly not in how they treated those who could immediately prove their authority, but in how they treated someone whose identity remained for the moment uncertain. That test, she reminded the crowd, was not one most people faced deliberately, but it was one everyone faced eventually in ordinary moments that rarely announced themselves as tests at all. Colin had failed that test, not because his instincts were inherently flawed, but because he had never once paused to question whether they might be, even when given the clear opportunity to do so. Sheriff Hale stepped forward at that point, addressing the gathered crowd directly, rather than waiting for a private moment, his voice carrying the genuine weight of a man who understood the scale of what his department's failure had nearly cost. He apologized to Sienna publicly, without qualification or excuse, acknowledging that Callan's actions reflected a breakdown in training and oversight that the department bore full responsibility for. He confirmed that Callan would be suspended immediately pending a formal investigation, and that the department would review its verification protocols to ensure no officer again mistook confidence for evidence. Colin, standing at the edge of the crowd with his badge already surrendered, said nothing. His earlier certainty replaced entirely by the quiet weight of consequence finally arriving. The massive steel gates that had sealed the base only hours earlier began their slow reopening, the same grinding mechanism now working in reverse, the anti-vehicle barriers lowering back into the roadway as the installation returned to its ordinary rhythm. Sienna walked toward the gate she had originally approached that morning, still dressed in the same plain civilian clothes, still carrying the same small canvas bag, though the sealed courier pouch had long since been delivered to its proper destination inside the command building. As she crossed the threshold back into the base she commanded, she found that Major Thorne had quietly organized the assembled Marines into 2 long honor guard rows flanking the entrance path. She walked between those rows slowly, offering only the briefest acknowledgement to each side, a small, composed nod that carried more weight than any elaborate ceremony could have managed. The Marines held their positions in respectful silence as she passed, none of them requiring further explanation for why this moment mattered, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something larger than a single morning's misunderstanding resolved. Voss fell into step slightly behind her commander as they continued toward the command building, matching her pace without a word, the 2 women moving together the way they always had, in quiet, practiced coordination born from years of shared responsibility. Behind them, the crowd outside the gate began to disperse slowly. The civilians who had witnessed the original arrest lingering a few moments longer than the rest, still processing what they had seen unfold in the span of a single morning. Some spoke quietly among themselves about the strange sudden lockdown, the arrival of the convoy, the astonishing sight of an entire base assembling information for a woman they had watched get handcuffed only an hour before. Others simply stood in silence, aware that they had witnessed something that would be difficult to fully explain to anyone who had not seen it themselves. A morning where assumption collided directly with reality, and reality had decisively won. Inside the command building, Sienna returned to her office for the first time, setting her small canvas bag down beside a desk that had waited untouched through her absence. She did not immediately review the mission debrief materials stacked neatly on her desk, nor did she call for any further action regarding Callan's fate beyond what had already been set in motion. Instead, she stood for a long moment at the window overlooking the parade ground, watching the base slowly return to its ordinary rhythm, vehicles moving again, Marines resuming their scheduled duties, the entire installation settling back into the disciplined order she had spent years building and protecting. Voss appeared in the doorway a short while later, carrying a fresh cup of coffee that she sat down on the desk without remark, understanding that her commander needed the quiet more than she needed conversation in that moment. Sienna thanked her softly, and for a while neither woman spoke, the silence between them comfortable and familiar, the kind that only formed after years of trust built through countless difficult mornings far harder than this one. Eventually, Voss broke the silence to ask gently whether the exercise had ever produced a result like this before, whether anyone else in the long history of Sienna's quiet, unannounced returns had ever failed the test so completely. Sienna considered the question for a long moment before answering, her gaze still fixed on the parade ground outside. She admitted that most people faced with an unidentified woman and a moment of genuine uncertainty chose caution and procedure over assumption, and that this was in fact exactly how the system was supposed to work most of the time. What made this particular morning different was not the uncertainty itself, which was ordinary and expected, but the choice one man had made to treat his own confidence as sufficient proof, discarding every available option to actually confirm what he believed before acting on it irreversibly. She told Voss that the lesson extended far beyond gate security or military protocol, that it applied to nearly every position of authority anyone might ever hold, whether behind a badge, a uniform, a desk, or simply the quiet power one person held over another in an ordinary daily interaction. Confidence, she said, was never a substitute for verification, and the speed with which someone reached for punishment often revealed more about their character than the situation itself ever could. Voss nodded slowly, turning the words over, understanding that she had just watched her commander live out in real time and at real personal cost exactly the principle Raven Ridge had quietly built its entire unannounced testing system around. News of the incident eventually reached beyond the base and the sheriff's department, circulating through the surrounding community in the way such stories inevitably did, passed between neighbors and co-workers who had heard some version of events from someone who had been near the gate that morning. The details shifted slightly with each retelling, as they always did, but the core of it remained consistent enough that most versions landed on roughly the same truth. A city officer had let assumption override procedure, had mistaken calm composure for deception, and had detained a decorated Marine colonel based on nothing more substantial than a hunch he refused to question, even when given every opportunity to do so. Collins' formal investigation stretched across the following weeks, moving through the sheriff department's internal review process with the same careful documentation that Hale had insisted on from the very first hour. The footage from his own patrol vehicle proved in the end the most damning evidence against him, showing with unforgiving clarity every step he had skipped and every warning he had dismissed. Hale made clear throughout the process that this was not a case of a single officer's isolated failure, but a reminder of what happened when instinct went unchecked by training, and he used the incident, uncomfortable as it was, to overhaul verification protocols across the entire department. Sienna never sought Callan's punishment beyond what the proper channels determined on their own, declining more than once to offer personal input on the outcome of his review, despite General Croft's repeated invitations for her to do so. She maintained in every conversation on the subject that her role was not to seek retribution, but simply to ensure that the systems meant to prevent such failures functioned as designed, and that the consequences Callan faced should come from established process rather than personal grievance. It was a distinction that impressed Croft more than almost anything else about the entire episode, a reminder of exactly why she commanded the respect she did throughout the Corps. In the months that followed, Raven Ridge's unannounced testing protocol, once a quiet, almost unofficial practice known only to a handful of senior staff, became formalized into the base's official training curriculum, studied by incoming security personnel as a case study in the difference between instinct and verification. Thorne oversaw the development of the new training material personally, incorporating the footage from that morning with appropriate redactions as a central teaching tool for every new class of gate personnel who passed through Raven Ridge. The lesson embedded in every session remained consistent with what Sienna had said aloud that morning outside the gate. Authority without accountability was nothing more than the appearance of authority, and that appearance collapsed the moment it met genuine scrutiny. Sheriff Hale visited the base again several weeks later, this time under far calmer circumstances, meeting with Thorne and Voss to discuss a formal partnership between city police and base security aimed at closing the exact gap that had led to the incident. He brought with him a written apology addressed personally to Sienna, delivered not as a formality, but as a genuine acknowledgement of how close his department had come to causing lasting harm through nothing more than one officer's unchecked certainty. Sienna accepted it with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, telling him plainly that growth mattered more than perfection, and that how a department responded after failure often said more about its character than how it avoided failure in the first place. Colin did not return to active duty. His formal review concluded with a permanent revocation of his commission, the department's findings citing repeated procedural violations and a demonstrated pattern of prioritizing personal judgment over established verification protocol in situations where the stakes for error were severe. He left the department quietly, without public statement, the confidence that had once defined him replaced by something far more subdued. Word occasionally reached Raven Ridge of what became of him afterward, fragments and rumors rather than confirmed fact, But nobody at the base seemed particularly inclined to follow his story further than the lesson it had already taught them. Late one evening, months after the incident, Sienna stood once more at her office window, watching the base settle into its evening routine. The parade ground quiet under floodlights, the perimeter fence secure and unremarkable in the way it was meant to be every single day. Voss found her there again, as she often did during these quiet evening hours, and the two women stood together in comfortable silence for a while before Voss finally spoke, asking whether Sienna intended to continue the unannounced testing practice despite everything that had happened. Sienna did not hesitate in her answer. She said that the entire point of the exercise had never been to catch failure for its own sake, but to ensure that when failure did occur, however rarely, the system built around it would respond exactly as it was designed to, protecting those who deserved protection and holding accountable those who forgot that authority came bound to responsibility. She added almost as an afterthought that true strength had never been about the power to give orders or the uniform one wore while giving them. It lived instead in the discipline to remain composed when someone else's judgment failed spectacularly and publicly against you, in the patience to let truth surface on its own timeline, rather than forcing it through anger or retaliation. That morning at the gate had tested her in exactly the way it was designed to test anyone who might one day stand in Callan's position, and she had passed it not through power, but through the same quiet restraint she asked of every Marine under her command. Voss nodded, understanding at last the full shape of what she had witnessed that morning, and the two women stood together a while longer, watching the base they both served settle peacefully into another ordinary night, secure not because its gates could lock in an instant, but because the people behind them had, in the end, chosen to answer for their mistakes. Long after Voss had gone, Sienna remained at the window a little longer, watching a young sentry make his rounds along the perimeter fence, checking each panel with the same careful attention she had once shown as a junior officer decades earlier. She thought of the countless mornings before this one, when she had walked that same road unrecognized and unremarked upon, met each time with the simple, unremarkable professionalism the system was built to guarantee. This single morning, the one that had gone wrong so completely, had also, in its own painful way, proven the system's worth more thoroughly than any of the quiet successes before it ever could. It had shown in the harshest possible terms exactly what happened when one person departed from that standard, and exactly how swiftly and completely an entire institution could close ranks around the principle that had been violated. She thought, too, of the young service members who had hesitated at the edge of that morning's crowd, torn between instinct and consequence, unable to intervene without risking their own arrest. She resolved to speak with them personally in the days ahead, not to correct them, but to thank them for the discomfort they had clearly felt. Discomfort that reflected exactly the kind of moral attentiveness she hoped every person under her command would carry into far smaller, far less dramatic moments than the one they had witnessed. It was easy, she knew, to recognize injustice when it wore a uniform and unfolded loudly in public. It was harder and far more valuable to recognize it in its quieter forms long before it ever escalated to handcuffs and locked gates. The following spring, Raven Ridge held its annual leadership symposium, and for the first time, the base invited officers from the surrounding city police department to attend a joint session on the ethics of authority and the discipline of verification. Sheriff Hale stood at the podium himself, addressing a room that included both Marines and civilian officers, retelling the events of that morning not as an isolated failure, but as a case study. Every department, military or civilian, needed to sit with honestly. He did not spare his own department the weight of the lesson, nor did he spare himself. Sienna sat quietly near the back of the room throughout his remarks, declining the invitation to speak again about an incident she considered by then fully resolved and thoroughly absorbed into the institution's memory. What remained, long after the headlines faded and the formal reviews closed? Their final files was a simple truth that had settled itself permanently into the culture of Raven Ridge. A gate could be built to withstand almost anything. Steel thick enough to stop a vehicle. Barriers deep enough to anchor against any assault. Alarms fast enough to seal an entire installation within seconds of a threat. But the truest security any institution possessed was never mechanical. It lived in the character of the people who stood watch at its edges, in their willingness to pause, to verify, to extend basic dignity to anyone whose identity remained for the moment simply unconfirmed rather than automatically suspect. That was the lesson Colonel Sienna Crow had spent her career building into the people around her. And it was the lesson that on one ordinary morning had finally been tested in the harshest way possible and had ultimately held.